You wouldn't believe what went down when our power-drunk HOA president decided she could bulldoze my sister's wheelchair ramp without warning. She must have thought she was untouchable, but she didn't know my sister isn't just anyone on this block. She's the governor of the state. And Karen, our self-appointed queen of HOA pettiness, was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. Thing is, when people like Karen overstep, they always think they're safe, that no one's watching. But this time, she was about to learn the hard way. I still remember the first time I saw that ridiculous yellow notice slapped on our door. It was a warm Tuesday morning, and I was just grabbing the mail when the bright paper caught my eye. Bold black letters screamed, "Violation Notice." I didn't even have to read it to know who it was from. Karen Thompson, HOA President, Neighborhood Tyrant. This was the fifth notice she'd sent us in less than a month, and every single one was about the same thing. Sarah's wheelchair ramp. I crumpled it in my hand and tossed it on the pile sitting on our kitchen counter. We didn't even read them anymore. Sarah rolled up behind me a minute later, her electric wheelchair humming softly as she climbed the ramp Karen hated so much. She gave me a tired smile, dark circles under her eyes from late nights at work. She never complained, though. Not about the job, not about the car accident that changed her life, and certainly not about Karen. "Another love letter?" she asked, nodding at the crumpled notice. "Karen's on a roll," I said, glancing out the window. And sure enough, there she was. Karen stood across the street, snapping pictures of our house like she was collecting evidence for a federal case. Her phone flashed as she zoomed in on the ramp, her sunglasses pushed up on her head like she was some Hollywood starlet. She wore her usual uniform, designer leggings, bright white sneakers, a tank top that said "Good Vibes Only." The irony wasn't lost on me. I thought back to the day we had the ramp built. We did everything by the book. Licensed contractor, city permits, matching paint colors. It was perfect. We even had Sarah's chief of staff double-check the regulations. Karen showed up before the concrete was dry, waving her HOA rule book like it was a court summons. "Section 8, paragraph 3, she'd said, tapping the page like it was a holy text. "All external modifications must be approved by the board." She gave us her plastic smile, the one that said she didn't care how nice she sounded. She wanted us gone. "We have to maintain our property values." I kept my cool. Sarah did too. We didn't tell anyone who she was. We figured it was easier that way. She needed privacy, space to recover from the accident, not more attention. But Karen kept pushing. Last week I caught her outside at 6 in the morning, measuring the angle of the ramp like she was planning a heist. When I confronted her, she gave me the usual line, just doing her job as HOA president. That's when I started documenting everything. Photos, videos, logs of every snide comment and fake-friendly conversation. I knew deep down this wasn't over, but even I didn't see what was coming next. It was Thursday morning. Sarah had an early physical therapy appointment. I was helping her into the car when I saw them. Karen standing by her mailbox, whispering to two men in dark suits. They kept glancing at our house, then back to Karen. One scribbled notes on a clipboard. The other took pictures. Sarah saw them too. "We should say something," I told her. "Maybe it's time they know who you are." Sarah shook her head. "I don't pull rank. We do this the right way." I wanted to believe her way would work, but when Karen handed those men thick manila folders, laughing like she'd already won, I got that knot in my stomach again. Something wasn't right. As Sarah's car turned the corner, I ran inside and checked our files. Permits, approvals, everything in order. But then I saw it. A letter we never received. A notice Karen claimed she sent weeks ago. I felt sick. The next morning I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. It wasn't subtle. The low rumble shook the windows. I grabbed my phone and ran to the front door. That's when I saw it. A massive yellow bulldozer sitting in our driveway. Karen stood right in front of it, her red blazer practically glowing in the sunlight. She was holding a clipboard and talking to a man in a hard hat. I hit record and stormed outside. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. Karen turned with that signature fake grin. "Oh, I'm so glad you're home," she chirped. She waved a paper at me, pulling it back just before I could grab it. "Emergency order from the HOA. This ramp is in violation of Section 4.23. We have city permits," I shot back. This isn't a city matter, dear. She was so smug I wanted to scream. This is an HOA matter. The bulldozer roared to life behind her. My stomach twisted. I flipped him through my phone, pulling up maps and permits. You can't do this, I said. This is illegal. You need a court order. Notice was given, Karen said, holding up a slip of paper with a signature that wasn't mine. I called Sarah, straight to voicemail. She was in a budget meeting, locked down. I tried her security. Nothing. I felt my pulse in my ears as two workers in bright orange vests laid down cones. One of them looked uneasy, glancing back and forth between me and Karen. I caught him whispering to his coworker. If you go through with this, I said, gripping my phone tighter, you'll be violating federal disability laws. The ADA doesn't make exceptions for HOA boards. Karen's grin finally twitched. We're exempt. No, you're not, I snapped, loud enough that a few curtains twitched on nearby houses. Lights flickered on. Our neighbor, Mr. Rodriguez, peeked outside. Then he disappeared back into his house. But I saw him come out again with a camera. Karen turned back to the bulldozer operator and gave a sharp nod. The engine roared louder. The blade lowered. Metal scraped concrete as it hit the edge of the ramp. I recorded every second. Pieces of cement cracked and split apart under the weight of that machine. My phone buzzed. It was a text, Sarah's security team. Stay calm. Help is 3 minutes out. I stared at Karen. She was directing the demolition like she was conducting an orchestra, waving papers and smiling for an imaginary crowd. She didn't see the black SUVs rolling onto the street. She didn't hear the sirens yet. But they were coming, and she had no idea what was about to hit her. 3 minutes later, the entire block looked like something out of an action movie. First came the SUVs, blacked out, no plates. Then the state police cruisers, lights flashing. Karen froze mid-sentence. Her clipboard dropped to the ground. The neighbors who'd been watching from behind closed doors now spilled onto their lawns, phones in hand. What's going on? Karen demanded. This is private property. But it wasn't Karen anyone cared about. Sarah's lead security officer stepped out of the first SUV, scanned the area, and opened the door. My sister rolled out in her chair, looking every bit the governor she was. She wore her official blazer, her state pin glinting in the sun. Mrs. Thompson, Sarah called, her voice calm but cold. This stopped being a private matter when you broke federal law. Karen opened and closed her mouth, fish-like. Sarah rolled forward, her team flanking her. You destroyed state property, she continued, holding up her phone. This ramp was installed under state disability grants. Would you like to discuss the ADA? I wrote the latest state protections myself. Karen backed up. Her eyes darted toward her HOA board members, but they were already inching away. Sarah motioned to her assistant, who handed her a binder thick enough to stop a bullet. We've reviewed your bylaws, Sarah said. You've broken more laws than I can count. Discrimination, illegal fines, and irregular finances. The neighbors gasped. Phones were everywhere now. Even the local news vans were setting up at the end of the block. Karen's face turned pale. I didn't know, she stammered. You didn't know I was the governor, Sarah finished. But ignorance doesn't excuse criminal behavior. Two state investigators stepped forward. One pulled out handcuffs. The other flipped open a notebook. Mrs. Thompson, one said, you'll need to come with us. Karen was still muttering about property values as they led her to the car. Sarah turned to the crowd. Neighbors, she said, this isn't just about me. It's about protecting everyone's right to live safely and with dignity. I filmed the whole thing. By the time the sun set, we were on every major news network. Karen's reign was over, but we weren't done yet. There was still a lot more to uncover. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating off the nightstand. I squinted at the screen. 50 unread messages, dozens of missed calls, half of them from reporters I'd never heard of. The footage from our security cameras had gone viral overnight. News vans were lined up on our street before I even had time to make coffee. But that wasn't even the most surprising part. An old friend of mine, someone I hadn't talked to since high school, was calling. He'd become a civil rights attorney, and he wasn't just calling to say hi. He'd found something on Karen, something big. I didn't believe it until I opened the files he sent me. Karen had been sued before. Not once, not twice, 3 times. Each time it was the same story. Different neighborhoods, different HOAs, but always the same pattern. Harassment, fines, intimidation. And each time she'd managed to wriggle out of trouble with quick settlements and non-disclosure agreements. She moved on and started the whole thing over again. This time she picked the wrong house, the wrong sister. Sarah wasn't just mad, she was fired up. She called an emergency press conference right there on our front lawn, the rubble of our old ramp still scattered around her. The reporters ate it up. Cameras flashed as she laid it all out. How Karen had broken not just federal laws, but nearly 20 different state housing regulations. And she had the receipts, signed documents, emails, witness testimony from half the neighborhood. But that wasn't the best part. One by one, our neighbors started coming forward. People we'd only waved to in passing. People we thought were fine. Turns out they had their own Karen stories. Mrs. Chen, who lived across the street, told us Karen made her tear out her entire vegetable garden, claiming it was unsightly, even though it was for her medical needs. Mr. Rodriguez, the quiet man who always worked on his car, showed us the paperwork from when Karen fined him for installing a lift for his elderly father. Even the Wilsons, who kept to themselves, told us how Karen threatened to fine them daily for putting up sensory-friendly playground equipment for their autistic son. For years, no one had said anything. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they thought they were alone. But not anymore. Karen tried to call an emergency HOA meeting to clear things up. Only 2 people showed, her closest board members, both of whom looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Meanwhile, half the neighborhood was in our backyard, where Sarah had invited advocates from the state's Disability Rights Office to give a talk about housing laws. People asked questions, they shared stories, they started planning, and then, like a final nail in the coffin, someone leaked Karen's financial records. They showed exactly where all those fines had gone, not to community projects like she claimed. Nope, straight into her own pockets. New appliances for her house, landscaping projects no one had approved. Private contractors fixing up her kitchen while telling the rest of us we couldn't paint our fences without approval. Her lawyer quit that afternoon. 3 of her board members resigned. One of them sent a blistering email to the news saying they had no idea what Karen had really been doing. That email ended up on TV, of course. Karen wasn't done yet, though. She marched right up to our front door the next morning, waving a cease and desist letter in my face. She accused us of slander, said we were destroying her reputation. I didn't even have to say anything. Sarah was already coming down the front ramp, and standing at the bottom of the driveway was the state housing commissioner. He wasn't there for a neighborly chat. He was there to audit every decision Karen had made in the last 5 years. The look on Karen's face when she realized it was over, I'll never forget it. But even then, she tried to argue, claimed she was just enforcing the rules, that she didn't mean for anyone to get hurt, that it was all a misunderstanding. No one bought it. The best part? As Karen retreated into her house, tail between her legs, our neighbors started putting up new signs in their yards. Not for sale signs, not notices. Signs that said, accessible housing, welcome here. One after another, yard by yard. By sunset, Karen's house was the only one without a sign. The news helicopters caught the whole thing. And by the next morning, we were on national television. But the real change wasn't in the headlines. It was in what happened next. Sarah and I spent the next week helping neighbors sort through years of bogus fines and violation notices. We found so much dirt on Karen, it was like peeling back layers of rot. But the more we uncovered, the more people spoke up. Mr. Jenkins told us about the time Karen made him tear down his daughter's treehouse because it didn't match community standards. The Wilsons found photos Karen had taken of their backyard without permission. Privacy violations on top of everything else. Sarah decided enough was enough. She unveiled her next move at a town hall meeting, packed wall to wall. She was proposing new legislation, laws that would protect homeowners from abusive HOA practices. She called it the Right to Home Happiness Act. And when she announced it, the room erupted in cheers. But that wasn't the knockout punch. Our security footage showed Karen had lied on her paperwork to get the bulldozer in the first place. She forged signatures, backdated notices, and bypassed approvals she didn't have the authority to make. When her own lawyer found out, he dropped her like a hot rock. 2 days later, Karen was packing up her house. She loaded her prized rose bushes, the ones she made everyone else plant, into the back of a moving truck. She was gone before the weekend. And the neighborhood? It didn't just go back to normal. It got better. The old violations office? We turned it into a community help center. Instead of sending fines, they send welcome baskets. If someone's house needs repairs, they organize volunteers. If someone needs accessibility modifications, they help cover the costs. Sarah's ramp got rebuilt, but it wasn't just a ramp anymore. Local artists painted murals along the sides, bright flowers, swirling vines, designs that glowed softly at night. Kids came by after school to see it light up. It became a symbol for the whole neighborhood. A month later, Sarah hosted a barbecue. We set up tables in the backyard, threw burgers on the grill. People brought homemade dishes, they brought their kids, they brought their dogs. It was the kind of afternoon that made you forget how bad things had gotten. Karen used to stand in her yard with a tape measure, making sure no one's grass was too long. Now nobody cared if you had a garden gnome or Christmas lights in July. And Mrs. Rodriguez? Her garden gnome army got a new member every week. Remember the bulldozer company? Turns out Karen had hired them through one of her own side businesses. But after the investigation, they cut ties with her. Their CEO personally apologized to Sarah. They even started offering free wheelchair ramp installations for low-income residents across the state. They launched a scholarship fund for students studying disability rights law. That bulldozer didn't just knock down our ramp, it set off something a whole lot bigger. As for me, I got a job offer I never expected. Sarah recommended me to head up a new state office focused on homeowner protection. My first assignment? Teaching other neighborhoods how to spot HOA abuse and stop it before it starts. I spend my days traveling, meeting people who've been through their own HOA nightmares. And when they ask if it's worth fighting back, I tell them our story. I tell them about Karen, about the ramp, and about how one small act of defiance can change everything. We're not done yet. Sarah says this is just the beginning, and looking around, I believe her. We've passed new laws. We've built a community where people feel safe and supported, and it all started with a ramp. Our story made it into school textbooks last month. They called it a modern civil rights case. But that's not the victory I care about most. The real win is watching kids ride their bikes down the sidewalk without fear of a violation notice. Seeing Mrs. Chen's garden in full bloom without Karen around to call it an eyesore. Watching Mr. Rodriguez's grandson help him onto the new lift without someone threatening to fine him for it. Last week, Karen's old house sold. A young family moved in. They've got 3 kids, 2 dogs, and get this, a wheelchair ramp for their grandmother. Nobody complained. In fact, 5 neighbors showed up to help them unpack. That's when I knew. We didn't just fix an HOA, we changed an entire community. And if Karen's watching from wherever she ended up, I hope she finally understands. Rules are supposed to protect people, not punish them. And when you forget that, there's always someone ready to remind you.